Hi there, I'm here having a virtual cuppa with Lisa Annese, CEO of Diversity Council Australia. We're here to talk through the COVID crisis through the lens of diversity. Hi Lisa, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Simon. How are you?
Yeah, good, good. Just yeah, Lisa, I suppose one of the things I wanted to have a chat to you about really is obviously you spend a lot of time talking to organisations, individuals, and groups about diversity, and so I wanted to find out from you, people you're chatting to, how is the COVID crisis affecting them as individuals, as businesses? What are those sort of frequently asked questions that you're being asked?
Well, initially, when the pandemic began and the economic impact of it was being felt, and the shutdown started to happen, the initial reaction from our members, at least, was how do we get our entire workforce working remotely, and how do we do it in a way where we can maintain productivity and team cohesion. So initially it was all about working flexibly. And even though we know at DCA, because we've authored so much research in the area, that flexible work is about more than just remote working, but nonetheless, it's an important component of it. That was the initial conversation.
Yeah,
But it's moved on, and people, I think, now we sort of moved into this middle area where people were really trying to figure out how to maintain connection with individuals in remote teams. Then a lot of people became very interested in mental health and well-being, especially with, there was a lot of people who were struggling with the isolation, especially if they lived alone, or if, for example, it was particularly challenging to work from home. They had a challenging working from home environment. So mental health and well-being continues to be a really important aspect of things that people are interested in. Also, along the same lines, with a whole workforce working remotely, the workplace isn't, the home environment isn't always a safe place for a lot of people. So organisations who are committed to, or a concern for the well-being of their employees were focusing on people who might be in domestic or abusive relationships and the impact that might be having on their ability to work safely, just their ability to be safe. And now I think there's been a lot of kind of conversations around the impact that COVID's had on particular groups within the economy, and some employers are interested in that, and certainly a lot of commentators are interested in that. But now I think a lot of people are trying to think, in the future, what's going to happen when we emerge from this?
yeah.
Will the workplace will be changed forever? And so I'm hearing some conversations like that happening.
Thanks, Lisa. I mean, you mentioned there obviously specific groups that have been impacted, and you sort of mentioned that as a bit of an overview there. How is this crisis impacting some of those specific groups that you're chatting to?
Well, we know, for example, with women as a cohort, depending on where they are in the economy, women have been particularly hit quite badly because of the pandemic. I mean, women tend to be concentrated in highly casualised employment. We know that casual work has been seriously hit. They tend to have been working in industries that haven't tended to benefit as much from government stimulus. We know there's been a lot of government stimulus in the construction and building industries, and we know that, for example, the childcare is an at-risk industry at the moment that really does require government intervention. That's heavily dominated by women. We also know that some of the professions that are essential workers, nurses and healthcare workers, teachers, people who work in supermarkets and things like that, highly concentrated groups of women. So they're working in more high-risk industries as well. So the pandemic's affected them from an employment perspective. We also know that when it comes to things like working from home, and if you're talking about couples in a heterosexual relationship with children, that the lion's share of the caring responsibilities, things like homeschooling, they've also negatively impacted women's ability to maintain productivity and engagement at work. So it just depends on which sector of the economy you're talking about. And there's some really good studies, or some studies that are emerging out of the University of Sydney that specifically look at this and the impact COVID-19 has been having on women in the economy. We know that with other groups, it's probably a little bit too early to tell whether there's been, you know, a negative impact on other groups, people from cultural minorities. We certainly know that the pandemic has, you know, coincided with the Black Lives Matter movement from the US. And so there's been a lot of engagement with employers around that issue as well. But I think the early signs are that that women probably are one of the groups that have been significantly affected.
Yeah. I mean, moving forward, I remember that we spoke a few years ago with an interview, and you talked in there about some of the dangers of lack of diversity going into the GFC, for instance, and then some of the benefits of diversity coming out, you know, organisations that were more diverse and how they would weather that storm. I mean, this obviously is a very different crisis, and you know, we're in the eye of the storm of it, really. But what do you see as the benefits to an organisation now of really keeping a focus on building a diverse team in its ability to, if you know, if it isn't completely destroyed by this crisis, but its ability to weather the storm and emerge stronger the other side? What are the main benefits of having a diverse team for that?
Well, they're no different to the benefits that they would be in normal times when we're not in a pandemic. That diverse teams that focus on inclusion are teams that are more innovative, where there's more, there's greater capacity to solve complex problems. We know inclusive teams, and it's very important to distinguish between teams that are simply diverse and teams that focus on the inclusion of diverse groups, because without the focus on inclusion, you just have a lot of excluded minorities, and so you never get the benefits of diversity. But certainly from DCA's Inclusion at Work Index, we do know that when organisations focus on inclusion, that they get those sorts of benefits around increases in productivity, engagement, creativity and problem solving. And we also know that there's a reduction in risk. So you're less likely to have things like harassment and discrimination happening within your workplace if you have an inclusive workforce and you're focusing on those things. So the benefits are the same. The difference is that because we're being met with challenges that require complex problem solving in many instances, and for some businesses and sectors, almost a reimagining of how they conduct their business and what their business looks like. Those sorts of things require creativity, and that's much more likely to come from a diverse team. So organisations that are focused on diversity and inclusion are, you know, have a good opportunity of the best possible outcome from the pandemic, notwithstanding that there are factors beyond any individual or organisation's control. I mean, if you're in a high-risk sector, no amount of diversity can save you if your sector's been decimated by the pandemic because you're in tourism, for example.
Yeah, I think that I mean, particularly in the early stages of the crisis, I remember the word that was used the most when that I heard more, I think, in those first couple of months of COVID, and I'd heard the rest of my life put together, was the word pivot. You know, and organizations having to, I quite like it as a word, having to pivot how they do business, having to pivot how they think, how they engage with their customers. I mean, you know, retail being a good example of shifting from on-premise, you know, physical stores to online, and having to shift that thinking. I think that having that more diverse team in terms of different ages, different backgrounds, different, you know, more diverse leadership helps an organisation think differently, doesn't it? I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that, I mean, the retail sector's been pivoting for quite a while because just changing consumer habits. But it's certainly true that everyone's had to work out how to do business differently. I mean, for a significant proportion of the economy that are in office-based work, it was an almost entirely new phenomenon to have to do business online and to be able have to work in teams in a virtual setting and build team cohesion and servicing customers and clients. I mean, look, one of the biggest sectors that's had to learn that the hard way is education. I mean, all of a sudden, all universities went completely online, and some did it better than others, and schools as well. And we know that parents had to weather a lot of that storm. But some did it. The ones that were already thinking creatively and thinking about how to access new markets and how to provide education in a new format were already set up to take advantage of or to be better prepared for this. So it depended on the sector, and it's true to say that for some sectors, it's not possible to work in, with COVID. So, it's been difficult. You can't do sort of, beauty, healthcare, running a gym, all of them, although a lot of gyms went online, but, varying degrees of success with people being motivated at home. So it does depend on the industry, but I think that everyone had to dig deep, and all of a sudden I think what happened was things that were too hard before COVID became possible because there was no choice.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we spent 3 years gradually evolving our ability to work flexibly and work from home. And I'm quite embarrassed when everyone else did it in 2 days. It was a bit of it took us a long time to do it. But I suppose in terms of like an organization that wants to start looking at building a more diverse team, it's front of mind now. These organizations want to do things differently and maybe looking at hiring people that are different to maybe sort of the standard, more homogenous profile they tend to recruit. What are the sort of low-hanging fruits an organization can implement to start attracting a more diverse team and build a more diverse company?
Well, it's interesting that you say that. And something I should have said in my initial how has COVID affected different groups of people is I glossed over people with disabilities, and actually how people with disabilities who've had to engage with the workplace in a different way have often been on the periphery of the workforce. And now, and they've sort of had to, depending on what the disability has been, but now when everyone's working virtually, they suddenly find themselves being more included. And so it's been a benefit to them. Suddenly, if you're someone, with autism who likes working through technology, all of a sudden you're not unusual. I know that I had a conversation with Beyond Blue. They presented at a DCA event, and they said that people with high levels of anxiety who are managing anxiety were already ready for something like COVID because they had a heightened radar for pessimism and for bad things happening. And actually now everyone else was operating in that same environment. So there was a greater degree of empathy around people with mental health and well-being, with lived experience of that. So that's really quite interesting. In terms of what organisations can do, we say low-hanging fruit. I mean, obviously, you mean right now or you mean in the future?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a complex subject. It's a big cultural shift, but in terms of, if I'm a small to medium-sized business and I start thinking, okay, I need to start thinking outside the square a bit around how I hire, I need to get some different thinking into my team. What are those sort of, I suppose, short-term things that companies can implement to make themselves more attractive to a more diverse team, or to start getting in front of a more diverse pool of candidates, I suppose?
Well, look, there's a lot of things organisations can do to broaden their appeal in the market. They can look at how they're currently doing hiring and if they've got barriers for people. So, for example, if you wanted to appeal to people with autism in the and you were looking to recruit, then you'd have to look at your recruitment process. And just something like having a in-person interview or even a Zoom interview might be a barrier for someone with autism, and a simple way of getting around that might be to give them the questions beforehand so that you can actually have an honest discussion that enables them to prepare properly. I mean, there are lots of things like that that you can do to appeal to lots of different groups. But unfortunately, just appealing to a lot of different groups, if you don't work on your internal culture as an organisation, even if you are successful attracting people who are different, if you then punish them for their difference once they enter the workplace because you don't know how to create an inclusive environment for diverse groups of people, or you don't know how to value different opinions, or you don't know what to do with constructive conflict, and you punish people for, or you look at people who might be massively introverted, for example, and you're an organisation that values extroversion in its leaders, if you don't know what to do and you haven't worked on the culture, then it doesn't matter if you've gone to the trouble of attracting people, you won't retain them. So actually, I'm really loath to say to people, you can do a couple of quick things, because actually what organisations need to do if they're serious about diversity and inclusion is take stock of who they are as an organisation, take stock of what they look like to the outside world, how people interact with them as an organisation, and then what are the processes of engaging. So whether that's through recruitment or once they recruit, what happens to people in that organisation? Do you recruit people because they're different and then you don't do anything about how you identify talent in your organisation or who you promote through to leadership? Or you recruit people because they have a particular gift or skill, but then you don't make the necessary adjustments in your workplace to make it inclusive. So actually organisations have to do a bit of work to be genuinely inclusive and to enable them to be successful in this. I've always thought, I mean, even something as you say, you said before you were embarrassed that it took you 3 years to get flexible as a workplace. I don't think that should be embarrassing at all. Working flexibly in a successful way, genuine flexibility, which is more than just remote working, giving people a laptop and saying, you know, from now on, everything's done online. I mean, genuine flexibility is around how you structure work in a team-based environment, how you shift from a focus on presenteeism to a focus on outcomes. It's around how you measure productivity. That takes time. It takes time to do that whole job redesign and to make it successful. Yes, organisations have adapted very, very quickly, but they haven't yet been through major stages of organisational growth. They haven't been through maybe a whole remuneration cycle. They haven't done massive, you know, recruitment or massive training or development, things like that, that they challenge your processes. And so those things actually take time to do well. So if we are to retain some of the benefits of what we've received from the COVID crisis, then I would urge people to remember that just because we all started working from home remotely, we actually still need to put a lot of effort into making sure we can successfully set up flexibility, for example. Setting up flexibility, if I was going to say what is one thing organisations can do that will increase the diversity of their workplace, it's to have a genuinely flexible work environment. Flexibility enables working parents to continue to contribute. We know it's a key enabler for women in workplaces. We know it's a key enabler for people with disabilities. We know it's a key enabler for people with mental health issues. We also know that it can be a key enabler for people from culturally diverse backgrounds. We know that from DCA research. So if you're going to do one thing, I would say focus on things like creating a mainstreamed flexible work culture in your organisation post-COVID that wasn't just about remote working, but was around all the aspects of flexibility with a focus on outputs. But again, that's not a simple thing to do, as you know.
No,
it takes
not.
time.
No. I think we found that when we were looking at flexible working, exactly what you said, that people tended to focus on the actual physical fact of you having a laptop and working in a cafe, as opposed to, you still focus on input rather than output and outcome focus. And the time was not necessarily spent on the technology we're using. It was more around how we thought, how we measured, how at the end of the day do you know if you've had a good day or not? How do you? And the number one thing that we've heard from managers is that they've been stressed because they don't know what the teams are doing. They're managing remotely, that they're not sure what they do from minute to minute. And the number one stress we've had from workers is that they are conscious that their managers don't know what they're doing. They sit, if they want to leave the laptop, because if the laptop goes idle, their manager not working. And so there's that sort of levels of stress of people not quite knowing what's expected. So I think that was the biggest thing we put in place, was saying that this is what's expected. It's really clear. It's really simple. Do this and you're fine, basically. That was the tough bit.
Yeah. Okay,
so for an organisation that having a genuine, flexible working environment that's sort of well thought out, well structured, is that biggest enabler, I think.
It will massively enable, as you probably discovered in your workplace, and you'll retain people who you highly value once their life moves into stages where they need flexibility. No one knows what's ahead of them in the future. So, it's a good retention tool.
Yeah, and we've had people in we've probably tripled, if not more, our average staff retention since you've been genuinely flexible working environment. We've had people go through different phases in life, through unexpected disability, obviously having kids, just all sorts of different changes people have gone through, and then it's been able to adapt to their different lifestyles, which has been awesome. What in terms of when we're looking at the future, and obviously no one's got a crystal ball to know what's going to happen in the future. It's hard enough judging what's going to happen day to day at the minute, really. But when you look at this and think what the other side of this looks like, what do you think are the main positives and negatives that are going to come out of this crisis, both from a diversity perspective and a broader perspective as well?
Well, from a society-wide perspective, I'm hoping that we won't lose sight of the fact that the professions that we really value and that really matter in a crisis are things around education and healthcare and childcare. And they're all female-dominated professions. And they have been traditionally low paid, low status, and the economy hasn't valued them with respect to what their worth is, I think. And it's contributed it's a component of the gender pay gap is attributed to the fact that women work in these undervalued professions. And we now know how important they're the bricks and mortar of our society. Who's caring for our children and our elderly people, who's caring for our sick, who's educating our children. And that's like the glue that keeps our society together. I really hope that what is known as women's work is valued. The other bit is that women's work, traditionally, things like housework and childcare at home, because research that DCA has done reveals that even when men and women in heterosexual relationships work similar hours in the paid workforce, women still do the lion's share of unpaid childcare and housework. I'm also hoping that with the heightened visibility around housework and childcare, that there might be more of an equitable distribution around that, because it's unfair, but also if there's the more male partners engage in that, the better. We know from our research that it's better for their relationships with their partners, it's better for their relationships with their children, etc. So they're probably the big things I hope come out of it. Now, the things that might be a bit, the things that are also important to me, but maybe not at that scale. I really hope we don't go back to all working in an office or working on a work site. DCA has been banging on about the benefits of flexible working, and I hope that we realise that it is possible to do things differently, that if you must, that you can. So I hope that happens. And I hope that we've learned a little bit about that we've sort of have a heightened radar and empathy for people who've had to engage in the workplace in a different way. That'd be my big wishes that come out of the COVID pandemic.
Yeah. I think that, I think the other thing as well in terms of diversity that I think will be a big positive from this is that, as you mentioned, the flexible working is a big blocker to a lot of groups who maybe might be underrepresented in, corporate world, for instance, and that sort of feeder of people into leadership roles in organisations that just isn't happening. I think that it's going to be very difficult for organisations now to say that someone can't have a role because they need a bit of flexibility, or they have a physical disability means they need to work from home more, or they have to work around school times. And it's you're not going to be able to look anyone in the eyes again and say no, you can't.
Can't be done. Yeah. Well, I hope that people's memories that last a long time. I don't know. It'd be interesting to see what happens, because people forget, I think.
Yeah, I homeschooled 3 kids while working, and it was, it nearly killed me.
I bet it did.
And I don't think I'll be forgetting in a while the relief when I could hand my kids back to a competent teacher again. I don't think I'll forget that.
How old are your children?
8, 10 and 12.
Okay, so you're right in the thick of homeschooling. Yeah, that's been hugely stressful for parents. I mean, I've always said to people who are doing it, look, God, just give them a book and some Play-Doh. Who cares if they're not going to do well in that plan? It doesn't matter. You just got to get through this period sane. I mean, we're not teachers. So I think parents need to really, realise that actually it's not possible to do it. And what we're also finding is that people are feeling guilty about having to do the homeschooling while working, so they are making up for it in hours, even though it's questionable as to whether that's a good thing. So their work day is just so long, and that's not healthy for anybody.
Yeah, I think that I hope that is something that we do move away from at the other side. Is the long hours and just the merging and the sort of the day being split between a bit of home life, a bit of work, right the way from when you wake up to when you fall asleep, because there's always work to be done. I think that the disability, I'm hoping that there will be more representation in organisations from different groups, because I think also I've had more conversations with people about mental health, mental wellness. There seems to be more sort of sensitivity and more openness where people have been struggling. People are more likely to reach out if they are struggling, or to ask other people if they're okay, which I think is hopefully again is something that continues. As an organisation, we've definitely thought about it and talked about it more than we ever have done before. So I hope that continues as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I mean by people who already lived with a mental health condition, all of a sudden feeling kinship with others, that people understood and had more empathy, because there were a lot more people struggling.
Yeah. Brilliant. All right. Well, that's a really positive note to finish on that. I really appreciate your time, Lisa. There's loads of research on the DCA website and resources for organisations there. But thanks for joining me for a virtual cuppa, Lisa. Appreciate it.
A pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
No problem.